Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. Today I'm going to talk to you about the Belgians in bolt action. Now, I'm sure some people out there, when they found out which army I played, thought to themselves, why would anyone possibly want to play the Belgians? What kind of pivotal role did they have in the war that could inspire anyone to try and relive those classic military moments from the ages? Well, the fact is, when I was deciding to get into bolt action, I did not want to do British, Americans, Germans, or Russians. Because, let's face it, everybody does those. Even the people that do the lesser armies probably also do one of those. So I wanted to be different, so I went through Warlord's website to see which armies that I could possibly choose that were slightly less well known in the conflict. And then as I was browsing the Belgians, I was taken by their fantastic array of hats, especially the berets worn by their elite troops. So at that point, I pretty much decided that it had to be the Belgians. So I did a little bit of research on their part in World War II. When I say a little bit of research, that's pretty much their entire history in World War II. So they weren't in it for very long, because they were pretty much crushed, and they were basically set up for defeat from the beginning by their allies almost, and then left to face the full force of the Nazi war machine pretty much on their own. So in the game they don't have access to a lot of the slightly more modern things that the other sides were able to get their hands on. So you're limited in that way, but on the other hand, your stuff's going to be a bit cheaper since it's not quite as good. But I did actually find it very interesting going through the history. I know pretty much the basics of history. The nitty-gritty details I'm not particularly interested in for the most part. But because there was so little to actually read on Belgium in World War II, I was able to take in quite a lot of it. So that was a bit of a change for me, because I don't normally delve into that much detail. Not that my army is in any way historically accurate, as you'll find out in a minute. Now, this picture that you're seeing here doesn't contain everything that I have in the army, because when this was taken I didn't have all the models that I do now, so you'll see pictures of the ones that were added later on. Because they're a little bit of a hassle to get out of the drawer and set up, just because they are all metal. So it's a little bit annoying having to carry them around all over the place. Obviously, being a bit of a niche army, there would be no money to be made whatsoever coming out with a plastic sprue for them, because there just wouldn't be the demand, so it's totally pointless. So I understand why they're all pretty much in metal, apart from a couple of the vehicles, which are mostly resin. But the model range is also quite limited as well. I'll get to how I filled in the gaps in the range in a moment. So let's go to this unit first, just your regular troops. Now these are the standard Belgian bodies, which you can put 3 different kinds of heads on. They have the standard helmet there, then at the back you can see one in the little cap. You can do entire units of those if you want, but I decided to just mix and match them in there. And then I just use these guys as the regular troops. So they don't have any particularly fancy options. You can give them a submachine gun, a BAR, a couple of other things that don't really seem particularly worth it. You can give them bicycles, which, to me, is a very strange option. It gets them onto the battlefield really fast, in a straight line, pretty much, on a road, and then they abandon their bicycle and then it's gone for the rest of the game. So I can see how it would be useful on occasion, but I'm not sure it would be worth the investment of actually buying models with bicycles. I'm not sure how people actually represent if they want to take the bicycle upgrade. Do they just have a couple of bikes on bases and just stick them in the squad and say, okay, this squad is on bicycles now? I don't know, I've never actually seen anyone do it. So I put them there in a squad of 9. I don't know if there's a particular number that's going to work best for those guys, but that's just how I've got them at the moment. In the game, they obviously fill just the generic infantry role, going out there doing their thing, not particularly specialised, not particularly terrible. Speaking of particularly terrible, move on to the next unit here, which are the Force Publique, which are the Belgian Congo soldiers. Now, they are in the army list, in the book. However, I'm pretty sure they would have never served in Europe. Because the Belgian army doesn't have a huge number of options, you sometimes have to improvise a little bit, especially when the Warlord model range doesn't fill everything that appears in the list. So these soldiers here are advancing Ascari from Foundry Miniatures, and they're very, very nice models. What I like about this unit is that you can have up to 20 of them in a single unit, which of course will have its uses. The one thing I've noticed about this game is that when you take a large infantry unit, it invites people to put a lot of firepower into them, trying to just pin them out of the game. But because they're inexperienced, they're probably going to be dying at virtually the same rate that they're being pinned. So that kind of negates that weakness of having a large unit, I think. So I think they will definitely have a purpose in the game. I haven't actually used them yet. And you can see the one guy there who is in the regular Belgian uniform is their officer. But I think they look very, very cool as well. As far as their uniforms go, I'm not sure whether they were wearing uniforms that looked exactly like that at the time of World War II. But I'm sure it would have been somewhat close. And whether bayonets would have been used at all in World War II, I'm not sure either, because the other armies don't seem to use them at all. But I think they look good. And they're quite happy running about in bare feet in the fields of Belgium. Next we've got a couple of anti-tank weapons here. Let's start with the anti-tank rifle at the front there, which is barely bigger than a sniper rifle, but it's incredibly cheap. They're only about 30 points each, and even though they can't really penetrate the armour of any kind of vehicle that has armour pretty much, they can probably do some damage to a very light armoured car or something, but when you actually get into tanks, it's not going to damage it, but what you are going to do is pin it. And for only 30 points, to have a chance to put pins on enemy vehicles regularly, I think that's a pretty good deal, actually. When I've used it, I've found that that was something that did come into play. If you can force people to keep taking those order tests, they're going to fail them sometimes, and for 30 points, it's giving you an extra dice in there as well. Seems like a very sensible option to me. Behind it, I would say, is the no-brainer of the army. First of all, it's a medium anti-tank gun, which is the best purely anti-tank weapon that they actually have in their entire list. And not only that, but you get one of them for free in your army, so you don't have to pay any points for it. One of their special rules. Well, you have to give them something, don't you? They're not exactly advanced. They're going to be lacking a lot of the things that other armies have, so give them a nice little bonus, a little special rule, so they can take a artillery piece like that for free. They can either take one of those, or I believe a medium howitzer. Medium howitzer is exactly the same amount of points, but I think this just seems like a better option, giving you some anti-tank capability. There are no other medium anti-tank guns in the Belgian army list. This is the only one you're going to get. So you might as well take one, for no points investment whatsoever. And it's certainly not to be sniffed at. It's definitely a lot more potent than the anti-tank rifle when it comes to taking out enemy vehicles. It broadens the list of potential targets that you can be taking out with this in there. Now, you'll see that these are not Belgians at all. These are actually Italian miniatures, which I've put Belgian heads on, because the Belgians currently do not have any command models at all. So the two on each side could either be just officers or medics, perhaps, and the one in the middle, who's operating a radio of some kind, I generally just use him as an observer, artillery observer, something like that. So the uniforms are fairly close. Once they're in the same colour, they blend in perfectly well. So that's what we have to do when we're playing these armies that don't have a huge range of models. You want to add a little bit of character in there. Why not the Italians? I went through a lot of potential models while deciding which ones would be best. And in the end, I think these ones won because the uniform's fairly close and they also have removable heads. They come with a choice of heads, so you can just not use the ones you get in the pack and use the spare Belgian ones that you get. The artillery observer is quite important to the Belgian army, I would say, because, like I was saying, they don't have an awful lot of firepower. So the artillery strike is one of their more potent abilities. And officers, I would say it's critical to have them, because you're going to have, especially if you're taking vehicles, because some of the Belgian vehicles have a special rule so that they must take an order test, even if they're not pinned. Yep, that is a special rule. special rule that's bad, which is kind of a theme with the Belgians. But, yep. So if you've got some officers around there to give them a little bit of a boost, to make it a bit more likely they're going to pass those tests, that's going to be nice for you. Speaking of vehicles, you can see there between some troops, there's the T-15 light tank, which is very, very cheap. This is one of those vehicles I was talking about that has to take an order test any time it wants to do two things at once, pretty much. If it wants to move forward and fire its medium machine gun, if it wants to do both those things at the same time, it needs an order test in order to do so. What I like about this vehicle, first of all, it's very, very cheap in points, as you'd imagine. It's very small, so it's not going to present a huge line of sight opportunity for the enemy. And also, it's kind of awkward for the enemy to deal with, because normal infantry aren't going to hurt it, because it does actually have some armour on it. It's classed as an armoured carrier. So if they want to deal with it, they're going to have to use some kind of anti-vehicle weaponry. And do they really want to divert something so heavy to shoot at something so feeble? So it gives them a little bit of a dilemma. Now, surrounding that tank there, you'll see a couple of infantry squads. Those are the elite fighters of the Belgian army, the Chasseurs Ardennais. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. We'll just call them Chasseurs anyway. So they can take pretty much the same equipment as the regular infantry. However, the difference with these guys is that they can take the tough fighters option, which is not to be sniffed at all. No enemy unit is really going to want to tangle with something that has the tough fighter rule where they're getting that extra attack. So if you get them into close combat, they are pretty tasty indeed. They are veterans, so they're going to be more expensive than the other infantry, which is why I've got them divided up into two units here, because if they are really expensive in a big unit, that's going to be an occasion probably where the enemy is just going to pin them to death and they're going to be unable to do anything. So splitting them up makes it a bit more difficult to deal with them, so probably one unit of them is going to get into the enemy, and also they can be dishing out twice as much pinning as well then. Apparently these guys fought very valiantly in the war and held up the Germans considerably until they pretty much had no support. And I think in the game they can actually live up to that. Just that tough fighters rule really makes them worth it for me. And of course, look at those hats. How can you say no to models like that? Whether they actually wore those hats during the conflict, I'm not sure. But like I said, I'm not going for too much historical accuracy here. Now in front of those chaps you can see a sniper. Now to make that I just took one of the regular infantry and put a scope on his rifle, which is the easiest way to do it. Either doing that or just finding one of the sniper kits where the uniform somewhat resembles them and putting a Belgian head on it. But I couldn't really find one close enough and I had a scope. So, simple. And to differentiate him even more, I don't know if you can see, but there's like a little, it's kind of a slightly bigger bush in front of him than is present on the other bases. Slightly different style of grass tuft, if you will. Obviously, sniper's very useful. If I see any enemy observers, for instance, he's probably going to have a go at them, going for officers and whatnot. Now, this next model, clearly not Belgian. This is a German heavy howitzer. Now, the Belgians do have an option in the book for heavy artillery, but there is no model for it. And I thought this one was the best option because it does come with the interchangeable heads. So again, I was able to put Belgian heads on it. And the uniforms, they don't look quite as close as the Italians, but close enough, I think. From a distance, you're not going to be able to really tell when they're in the right colour and everything. I can understand why they haven't released a model of it if people aren't buying the Belgians, and it's big, so it's probably more expensive to create. But it is something that I feel they need, because they're so lacking in anything heavy at all. The word heavy only actually appears twice, I think, in the Belgian army list. It appears in the heavy artillery and in the heavy machine gun, which they don't have a model for either. So the only two things in the whole list that are heavy, there are no models for them yet. So this is an occasion where you'd really want to improvise. Also, you're taking advantage of the free artillery rule here, because normally you wouldn't be able to take this and the medium anti-tank gun in the same platoon, but because one of them's free, then you can have them both. So, nice bit of heavy artillery there. Downside to this model is that it's 100% metal, so if I ever drop it on the floor, either the model's going to be completely destroyed or it's going to just goes straight through the floor. Probably through multiple floors, actually. It is incredibly heavy. It's quite difficult to get it to stay on the base. As you can see, I've built a little mound with a little fence there at the front, which I think makes it look a lot better. Anytime you add something to a base that really looks like it should be there during a battle, it adds a little bit of narrative, a little bit of character to it. Now, in this picture here, we've already looked at the T-15, but what's that tiny vehicle next to it, I hear you ask? Well, this is the only currently available Belgian tank destroyer. Now, it has exactly the same gun on it that the medium anti-tank gun has. However, this is considered a light anti-tank gun, and that might make you think, well, how does that make any sense at all? They've got exactly the same gun, but one of them's medium, one of them's light. But they also have to take into account a gun that's dug in compared to a gun on a very, very flimsy vehicle that's going to be rattling around all over the place. And actually, I did look this up. In the war, these weren't put into service as actually moving vehicles because the recoil of the gun was too much for the vehicle to take, so they only used them as static emplacements. So it makes sense that this is only considered a light gun. However, it does give the Belgians some much needed manoeuvrability with their anti-tank weaponry. Even though it's not as potent as the medium anti-tank gun, it can actually move to get shots off, so the enemy can't avoid it quite so easily. Again, it's pretty cheap. It has the same kind of armour that the T-15 has. It is open-topped though, so it is a little bit more vulnerable that way. However, it doesn't have to worry about the order tests for doing two things at once, because as you can see it's got two men in it there, one presumably driving and one operating the gun. Now, one bad thing, these are probably the two best Belgian vehicles available at the moment, which is sad I know, but they are both in the same section of the army list. So if you want to use them both, you have to have a second platoon, which is what I plan to do most of the time, because I want to squeeze as many options in there as possible. So currently I'll definitely be using 2 platoons in games so I can get both of these in there, because the other vehicles that I would like to own don't currently have models yet, and those are in the armoured cars and recce vehicles section, which you could also take one of in addition to one of these tanks. And oddly enough, their best tank is actually in the armoured car section, and that's the ACG-1, which has a light anti-tank gun on it, coaxial medium machine gun, but it has stronger armour than these two, and it also has the recce rule, which makes it much more survivable. So I'd really like to get one of those, but unfortunately, no manufacturer out there does those in the right scale at all. The only ones I've seen are for 20mm miniatures, I think. So if anyone knows of one, please feel free to let me know, because I've never seen one in the right scale. I can understand why people don't necessarily produce them, because they weren't very prevalent in the war. I believe there were only about 8 of them that actually saw any action, because there was some manufacturing issue with them. But the other vehicle is the armoured car, which also has a medium machine gun on it, slightly lighter armour than the tank though. That has the recce rule as well, and I have actually seen a model of that I would like to get at one point. So really that would just be a better version of the T-15 tank really. Downside being that it would be open-topped, obviously, with it just being an armoured car, but I would like to get one of those. And having 2 platoons, you could actually use all 4 of those vehicles in a fairly small game. So what you lack in power, you could make up for in numbers, perhaps. Now there are some units in the book that either don't have models or I just don't have. You can take cavalry, which certainly don't have models, and I've never really experienced those in bolt action. I've never seen a game where anyone's been using cavalry, so I don't know if they're much use at all. They can take machine guns and heavy machine guns, which will definitely have their use, but I don't personally have any, there aren't models for them. They can take mortars, except there are no models for those. Light and medium. There's no model for the sniper, but as you saw, I just improvised my own. They do have a model for an infantry gun, which is a light howitzer. However, I do not own it, because at the time I was only running 1 platoon, and I wanted to use the medium anti-tank gun, and I was planning to get heavy artillery. So really I could get one of those as well, and throw it in there, for when I use the 2nd platoon, since the model is out there. They can take an anti-aircraft gun as well, but again there's no model for it, so you'd probably have to use one from another side. I think the British have a weapon that's very, very similar, so that could probably easily be used. They can take light and medium and heavy howitzers, but no models available, so you saw what I did, I just used a German one for the heavy. Vehicles, they do actually have a model for the FT-17, I think it is, which was a World War I tank. So when you look at the special rules for this, oh dear, it has the one-man turret rule, which is when they have to take an order test if they want to do two things at once. The best rule, slow, pitifully slow. So it's slower than any other tank in the game. Okay, you think that's fair enough. Also, the light anti-tank gun is low velocity, which means that it's even less potent than a light anti-tank gun. Now, they are fairly cheap, these tanks, as you'd imagine, but when you actually upgrade it to have the low velocity light anti-tank gun, it's not that cheap. It's only a little bit cheaper than the tank destroyer, but its gun's nowhere near as good, and it's extra slow. But it's not open top though, so there is one plus to it, but I don't think I'll be getting one of those. Also, they have various transport options, which I'm not going to go into, because they pretty much speak for themselves. I can understand the use of having maybe a truck to unload some troops further onto the table. And they have a tractor that can carry artillery pieces around. Again, I'm not overly convinced of the merit of taking those. So in the book, the Belgian list only takes up about 1/6 of the book, the armies of France and the Allies. But the rest of it's interesting to read as well, about the other minor nations in the conflict. France, of course, being the biggest in the book, but you also get the lists for Norway, Poland, Greece and the Netherlands, and so on. But they don't have quite as stylish hats as the Belgians, sadly for them, so they didn't interest me. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this little discussion on the Belgian army. I hope you'll join me in rallying for future Belgian releases, especially some of the vehicles that they're lacking at the moment, and command models would be nice as well, maybe a machine gun. Come on, Warlord. You know there's demand for the Belgians out there. Can't be just me, surely. Come on.